Hello, listeners. Welcome to our English program podcast, Kaleidoscope. Listeners, in our today's program, we have a talk on the topic Perennial Grief of Sisyphus, a tribute to Albert Camus. This talk will be given by Professor Dr. R.Y. Shinde. Talking about Dr. R.Y. Shinde, he has worked as the head Department of English and Vice Principal of Kisan Veer College, Y. After retirement, he is settled in Pune. He is editor of International Journal, translator, writer, commentator, reviewer, music critic, travel enthusiast, and a tech savvy academic. He was taught by internationally acclaimed teachers from Oxford when he took his MA from the Department of English of Savitribai Phule, Pune University in 1984. He wrote his doctoral thesis on Vijay Tendulkar's plays, in which he translated four of his plays, which is the unique PhD work in English in India. So let us listen to his talk on the topic Perennial Grief of Sisyphus, a tribute to Albert Camus.
Dear literary enthusiasts, today we pay tribute to Albert Camus, whose birth anniversary we celebrate today, and as a tribute to him, we talk about the perennial grief of Sisyphus, which is our tribute to Albert Camus. Albert Camus was born November 7th, 1913, Mondovi, Algeria, and he died on January 4th, 1960, near Sens, France. He was a French novelist, essayist, and playwright, best known for such novels as L'Étranger or The Stranger, La Peste or The Plague, and La Chute or The Fall, and for his work in leftist causes. He received the 1957 Nobel Prize for Literature. Less than a year after Camus was born, his father, an impoverished worker, was killed in World War I during the First Battle of the Marne. His mother, of Spanish descent, did housework to support her family. Camus and his elder brother Lucien moved with their mother to a working-class district of Algiers, where all three lived together with the maternal grandmother and a paralyzed uncle in a two-room apartment. Camus' first published collection of essays, L'Inverse et l'Android, or The Wrong Side and the Right Side, describes the physical setting of these early years and includes portraits of his mother, grandmother, and uncle. A second collection of essays, Gnosis or The Nuptials, contains intensely lyrical meditations on the Algerian countryside and presents natural beauty as a form of wealth that even the very poor can enjoy. Both collections contrast the fragile mortality of human beings with the enduring nature of the physical world. In 1918, Camus entered primary school and was fortunate enough to be taught by an outstanding teacher, Louis Germain, who helped him to win a scholarship to the Algiers Lycée, that is high school, in 1923. You'll be very interested to know that it was very typical of Camus' sense of loyalty that after 34 years, when he received Nobel Prize for Literature, he dedicated it to this teacher, Mr. Germain. It was a period of intellectual awakening, accompanied by great enthusiasm for sport, especially football, which is called soccer, swimming, and boxing. In 1930, however, the first of several severe attacks of tuberculosis put an end to his sporting career and interrupted his studies. Camus had to leave the unhealthy apartment that had been his home for 15 years, and after a short period spent with an uncle, Camus decided to live on his own, supporting himself by a variety of jobs while registered as a philosophy student at the University of Algiers. At the university, Camus was particularly influenced by one of his teachers, Jean Grenier, who helped him to develop his literary and philosophical ideas and shared his enthusiasm for football. He obtained a diplôme d'études supérieures in 1936 for a thesis on the relationship between Greek and Christian thought in the philosophical writings of Plotinus and Saint Augustine. His candidature for the aggregation, or a qualification that would have enabled him to take up a university career, was cut short by another attack of tuberculosis. To regain his health, he went to resort in the French Alps, his first visit to Europe, and eventually returned to Algiers via Florence, Pisa, and Genoa. Throughout the 1930s, Camus broadened his interests. He read the French classics as well as the writers of the day, among them André Gide, Henri de Montalent, Henri Malraux, and was a prominent figure among the young left-wing intellectuals of Algiers. For a short period in 1934 to 35, he was also a member of the Algerian Communist Party. In addition, he wrote, produced, adapted, and acted for the Théâtre du Travail, or Workers' Theatre, later named the Théâtre de l'Equipe, which aimed to bring outstanding plays to working class audiences. He maintained a deep love of the theatre until his death. Ironically, his plays are the least admired part of his literary output, although Les Malentendus, or Cross Purpose, and Caligula, first produced in 1944 and 45 respectively, remain landmarks in the theatre of the absurd. Two of his most enduring contributions to the theatre may well be his stage adaptations of William Faulkner's Requiem for a Nun, Requiem pour une Nun, in 1956, and Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Possessed, or Les Possédés, 1959. In the 2 years before the outbreak of World War II, Camus served his apprenticeship as journalist with Alger Republicain in many capacities, including those of leader, that is editorial, writer, sub-editor, political reporter, and book reviewer. He reviewed some of Jean-Paul Sartre's early literary works and wrote an important series of articles analyzing the social conditions among the Muslims of the Kabyle region. These articles, reprinted in abridged form in Actualis 3rd, 1958, drew attention 15 years in advance to many of the injustices that led to the outbreak of the Algerian War in 1954. Camus took his stand on humanitarian rather than ideological grounds and continued to see a future role for France in Algeria while not ignoring colonialist injustices. He enjoyed the most influence as a journalist during the final years of the occupation of France and the immediate post-liberation period. As editor of the Parisian Daily Combat, the successor of a resistance news sheet run largely by Camus, he held an independent left-wing position based on the ideals of justice and truth and the belief that all political action must have a solid moral basis. Later, the old-style expediency of both left and right brought increasing disillusion, and in 1947, he severed his connection with combat. By now, Camus had become a literary figure, a great literary figure. L'Étranger, which is actually the US title of as The Stranger, and the British title is The Outsider. A brilliant first novel begun before the war and published in 1942, it is a study of 20th century alienation with a portrait of an outsider condemned to death less for shooting an Arab than for the fact that he never says more than he genuinely feels and refuses to conform to society's demands. The same year saw the publication of an influential philosophical essay, La Mythe de Sisyphe, The Myth of Sisyphus, in which Camus, with considerable sympathy, analyzed contemporary nihilism and a sense of the absurd. In 1957, at the early age of 44, Camus received the Nobel Prize for Literature. With characteristic modesty, he declared that had he been a member of the awarding committee, his vote would certainly have gone to André Malraux. Less than 3 years later, he was killed in an automobile accident. As novelist and playwright, moralist and political theorist, Albert Camus, after World War II, became the spokesman of his own generation and the mentor of the next, not only in France but also in Europe and eventually the world. His writings, which addressed themselves mainly to the isolation of man in an alien universe, the estrangement of the individual from himself, the problem of evil, and the pressing finality of death, accurately reflected the alienation and disillusionment of the post-war intellectual. He is remembered with Sartre as a leading practitioner of the existential novel. Though he understood the nihilism of many of his contemporaries, Camus also argued the necessity of defending such values as truth, moderation, and justice. In his last works, he sketched the outlines of a liberal humanism that rejected the dogmatic aspects of both Christianity and Marxism. Modern existentialism reproduced such ideas and combined them in more or less coherent ways. Human existence is, for all the forms of existentialism, the projection of the future on the basis of the possibilities that constitute it. Now, here we come to the myth of Sisyphus. The myth of Sisyphus is a philosophical essay by Albert Camus, published in French in 1942, published in the same year as Camus' novel La Tranger. The myth of Sisyphus contains a sympathetic analysis of contemporary nihilism and touches on the nature of the absurd. Together, the two works established the reputation, and they are often seen as thematically complementary. Influenced by the philosophers Soren Kierkegaard, Arthur Schopenhauer, and Friedrich Nietzsche, Camus argues that life is essentially meaningless. Although humans continue to try to impose order on existence and to look for answers to unanswerable questions. Camus uses the Greek legend of Sisyphus, who is condemned by the gods for eternity to repeatedly roll a boulder up a hill only to have it roll down again once he got it to the top, as a metaphor for the individual's persistent struggle against the essential absurdity of life. According to Camus, the first step an individual must take is to accept the fact of this absurdity. If, as for Sisyphus, suicide is not a possible response, the only alternative is to rebel by rejoicing in the act of rolling the boulder up the hill. That is, the sense of rebellion is the most creative way to counter the punishment given by God, given by destiny, given by any system. Camus further argues that with the joyful acceptance of the struggle against defeat, the individual gains definition and identity. For me, the myth of Sisyphus marks the beginning of an idea which I was to pursue in The Rebel. He says, the writer says it attempts to resolve the problem of suicide, as the rebel attempts to resolve that of murder, in both cases without the aid of eternal values, which temporarily perhaps are absent or distorted in contemporary Europe. The fundamental subject of the myth of Sisyphus is this: it is a legitimate and necessary to wonder whether life has a meaning. Therefore, it is legitimate to meet the problem of suicide face to face. The answer underlying and appearing through the paradoxes which cover it is this: even if one does not believe in God, suicide is not legitimate. Written 15 years ago in 1940, amid the French and European disaster, this book declares that even within the limits of nihilism, it is possible to find the means to proceed beyond nihilism. In all the books I have written since, I have attempted to pursue this direction. Although the myth of Sisyphus poses mortal problems, it sums itself up for me as a lucid invitation to live and to create. My friends, we have to look at Camus in this very important perspective that he assertively tells us that human being is much more important than any system created by man or created by anybody or even the destiny. He says further that it is useful to note at the same time that the absurd hitherto taken as a conclusion is considered in this essay as a starting point. That is, absurd is not a conclusion, it is a starting point. In this sense, it may be said that there is something provisional in my commentary. One cannot prejudge the position it entails. There will be found here merely the description in the pure state of an intellectual malady. No metaphysics, no belief is involved in it for the moment. These are the limits and the only bias of this book. Certain personal experiences urge me to make this clear. Now we'll look at the important quotations from this book. The first quotation: man simply invented God in order not to kill himself. That is, God is afraid that he might be killed. Therefore, man created God. That is the summary of universal history down to this moment. Second quotation: it is worth noting that the works of Kafka can quite as legitimately be interpreted in the sense of a social criticism. For instance, in The Trial, it is probable, moreover, that there is no need to choose. Both interpretations are good. In absurd terms, as we have seen, revolt against men is also directed against God. Great revolutions are always metaphysical. The last and very important quotation: this essay deals with a certain temptation. It is essential to have known it. One can then act or not, but with full knowledge of the facts. Thank you very much.
So, listeners, that was the talk on the topic Perennial Grief of Sisyphus, a tribute to Albert Camus. This talk was given by Dr. R.Y. Shinde. Hope you enjoyed listening to this talk. We'll be back with another exciting program. Until then, thanks for listening and please stay tuned as our next program follows.